Stephen, how are you? It's so wonderful to have you.
Good morning, Alex. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for hosting this event and putting this event on. It's wonderful. Thank you.
So welcome, no worries. So just a little bit about Stephen. So Stephen Berkeley, Stephen is a change and culture facilitator who helps individuals, teams and organisations and communities gain clarity around what's important to them and, where they should be focusing specifically with their energy. Now, he specialises specifically in helping leaders create value-based cultures, and he has 3 decades experience at a leadership level across 3 different countries. So Australia, England and India. That's incredible. So Stephen, it's so wonderful to have you here today, and I'd love to dive in, if I may, and let's get straight into it and get our hands dirty. So tell me a little bit about values and why you're so passionate about values specifically.
Thank you. My journey into the values domain started back in the mid-90s, and I met a woman by the name of Diane Tillman, and she was the author of a program called Living Values Education.
Right.
And I was really inspired by this work, and she had created a whole heap of material to help teachers incorporate conversations on values into the curriculum. So how to incorporate a discussion on respect into mathematics, how to incorporate a cooperation into a discussion around history. And they were very, very practical things, and I was really inspired by it. And so I ended up becoming the coordinator of the Living Values Education program in Australia, and I ran about 16 different facilitator training programs across Australia. And it was in those that really the conversations around values was just amazing to witness. And so we would facilitate these events, and then we'd get the teachers back and we'd listen to them about what was the impact that was having on the classroom and what was the impact within the, what do you call it? The room where the teachers, the staff room, the conversations changed.
Right.
And so, I just saw some amazing stories of one particular teacher was telling me she had the class that nobody else wanted, and that every kid in this class was a troublemaker. And within a term, she turned it all around. And she said extraordinary things where the kids would start talking to other kids if they saw that they were having trouble with a value, and their language just changed. So
Isn't
it became,
incredible?
and then because she managed to turn that class around, then everybody else got interested in the values. So that was a real eye-opener to me. And then around the same time, I was living in Newcastle, and a colleague of mine, AJ, and we started running conversations called Values in Action in the community in Newcastle, because we had run a similar exercise within our own organisation, and we saw the benefits that it had had. And to celebrate our organisation's 10th anniversary, we decided to have a conversation around values. Well, there was a reason behind that, because the hospital that we were in was a greenfield site hospital, and when it was built, they brought in 3 different hospitals. They closed down 3 different hospitals and they brought them all into one. And 10 years later, you could go into the operating theatre tea room, and the staff from one hospital were sitting in one corner, the staff from the other hospital were sitting in the other corner, the staff from the other hospital. This is 10 years later. And so we'd never shaped one culture for that organisation. We still had 3 sets of values, 3 sets of cultures operating within the one organisation.
Wow.
So we had an organisation-wide conversation around values, and we trained 40 facilitators to help us facilitate this conversation. We got in a creative director who designed a film. We went around talking to people around values, and we used that as a basis of the conversation in the organisation. And what really, a couple of times when I was facilitating, I remember one person saying, and she said, that I've been working with this person for 10 years and I can't believe I didn't realize that she values the same things as I do.
Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? Thank you for sharing your stories with us, Stephen, because it's really key. If I can just take you back to the school situation, that really made an impact and stood out. What stood out for me was the language, how suddenly this, and that's very powerful story you shared here, because it makes a difference. And I think it's key to be bringing this into the schools, generally speaking, to find the language around it, because I mean, we don't know what we don't know. And once we start to become more familiar with what values are, firstly, because a lot of people, I guess, and tell me if you agree with this or not, or if you found this, that a lot of people, in terms of their values, they're not familiar with them. So it's just they tend to inherit idealistic values, which really are meaningless. Yet when we know what values mean and we have a solid understanding around them and the impact they have, because they are very powerful drivers, both personally and professionally, that it can just open up incredible opportunities and just unite people. Yeah.
Totally. Look, I can remember one of these community workshops that we ran, and it was around the time, the early 2000s, and I think it was Enron, the disaster, not the disaster, around the collapse. And it was interesting. We had 60 people in the room, and I think it's a little bit like the pandemic and how, you know, I've noticed a huge surge in articles and posts and literature about values in the last 6 weeks. Not so much at the beginning of the pandemic, but particularly towards the end, and particularly with the Black Lives Matter and the brand ethics and a whole range of things that were coming up. But back at that time, we had 60 people in a room, and it was interesting that the number one, the value that was coming up at that particular time for everybody was around honesty. And you have the conversations at different times, and things will be of more importance. But I'll remember specifically, as I was walking out, there was one lady, she was at the back of the room, and she was just sitting there quietly crying. And I just asked her, and I just sat down beside her, and I said, "Is everything okay?" And she just looked at me and she said, because we just asked very simple questions to draw out your values. And she said, "I can't believe I haven't asked myself these questions."
Wow, that's very powerful.
And this was just a 2-hour session. And they're really simple questions. You know, you can be around a leader, as we had, and what was the values that you admired in that particular person, or a piece of literature, or you're just drawing things out of them. And so I think that the conversations have the power to really shift perspectives, and that's what it did in the hospital.
Yes.
That, you know, that we don't underestimate. It's important that organizations have their organizational values, but it's also important that they give everybody else an opportunity to talk amongst each other about their values, because that's where trust builds. That's where people will have the back of their colleague because they know what they stand for.
Yeah, you know what, Stephen, I couldn't agree more with you. And I see what you just mentioned with the hospital and it being, you know, the organization itself, but then having 3 different silos almost. And silos are always created within organizations because people aren't clear. They have no clear direction as to where they're heading. And the values aren't, although they're pinned all over the walls and all over the internet or whatever, people have no idea what they are because, you know, they're not being people aren't walking their talk, you know, they're just sort of sitting there stagnant, meaning nothing. So it's really about bringing them alive and creating meaning around them. And by meaning, I mean, you know, really sort of in embracing them and being the values. That's what it's about, you know.
Yeah, bringing them alive through stories.
Yeah.
And creating opportunities, creating safe spaces for people to have conversations. And as I said, yeah, it's important to have had the conversation about your organizational values, but organizational values don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within the context of personal values and community values and a whole heap of other contexts that are going on. And as Jeffrey was mentioning, you know, it's really important to have different perspectives
Yes.
And, you know, people talk about having values fit. Look, it's important to have diverse values within your organization. It's important to have people that think differently than you and have different perspectives.
Yeah.
And so it's about giving people the opportunity to have personal conversations.
Totally. And values are also a great way, and they're powerful, helping us to change our behaviors as well. Because as we were talking about with Jeffrey as well, and now yourself, Stephen, is that it's really important to continuously stand back and watch what's working, what's not. How can we change things? And values must always be at the core of that, you know, that because they are our drivers when it comes to changing our behaviors. And so they support us to move towards whatever it is that we want to experience in terms of value, in terms of result, or whatever it is that we need. So it's really important. We don't spend enough time with them. I think it's so value itself is undervalued. We're just underestimating the power of them. Would you agree?
Totally. Look, I was recently doing some work for an organization in Mumbai. It's a large publicly listed company. And what was interesting, they'd got us in to help them with their strategy, the longer term strategy. And part of that as a diagnostic, I was going around and speaking to all of the leaders. And what I was noticing was that they weren't even, their offices were next door to each other.
Right.
They weren't having lunch together. They weren't even getting up and going around and having chats to each other. And so as part of the strategy, you know, and they got us in to deal with strategy, and yeah, you know, you've got to do that. But we started it off with some personal exploration questions to help them to get to know each other, because they were spread across the country. And simple, again, really simple questions. We don't actually use the word values, but the questions are eliciting values, and then they use that language when they're feeding back to about what were their insights about their conversation.
Yeah.
And then lo and behold, the next time we meet, they're having lunch together. They've got a whole range of new projects together. And it was like they were so busy in their performance indicators and getting stuff done, they just didn't know each other.
Yeah.
And simple questions enable people to understand what people value.
Yeah, I really love that you raised that, Stephen. It's so pertinent. You know, we sort of do get so automatically so conditioned in the do, we forget to take a step back and, like you said, explore the individual for who they are, you know, and what they bring in terms of their emotional state, in terms of their values, their beliefs, their attitudes, all those really important things, their standards, their experiences, which essentially create this individual. Instead, we're blinded to all of that, and we just get into this automated, it's like you're jumping in a car and driving and not even noticing what's around you. There's no expanded awareness of anything. So, you know, bringing in the values, I think, is so key, because then it's allowing for so much more.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
I appreciate what Jeffrey was saying, that it's all about the spirit. There's a spiritual realm here, and I found that, you know, 20 years ago when I was in that same hospital, I was told not to use the word spiritual. Things have changed a lot, and even today I don't need to use that. But when you have a conversation around values, aspects of spirituality actually come up, even if they may not label it as that. But really what you're giving people is an opportunity to be more aware of what's important to them and more aware of what's important to the people that they're working with.
Yeah.
And then that creates, there's a really nice example of this. Last year, there was an institute that were training masters in public health students. And I was well known to this institute, and they had a group of 40 students, and they'd been all working together for a year, but all of the academics and the faculty felt that they weren't gelling together very well. There was a little bit of conflict. So they invited me there for a day, and I did a similar process where we were some really simple questions around exploring their values. Now, in the very first exercise at the beginning of the day, two of the people who were the most at conflict with each other, and I didn't know that they were, and I managed to pair them together. And so they ended up having a conversation. And at the end of the day, one of the women stood up and said, that conversation for me changed everything. I'd had all of these ideas in my head about who this person was and what she stood for, and it was all in my imagination.
Wow.
And you could tell within 2 hours that the energy and the atmosphere in the room had changed. And the faculty reported back that there was significant improvement in their cohesiveness and their harmony. And it was just them sitting down and having a conversation about what they valued.
Absolutely. And that's so important, which brings me to my next question for you, Stephen. What is your take on, or what is your view on the importance of hiring then to values? Because I think a lot of organizations just sort of hire, from my experience over the last 3 decades, they hire just for the sake of filling a gap, filling a hole, bums on seats type attitude. Whereas in terms of them hiring to values, what's your opinion around that? And I if you can share your view there.
There is research around it, and there's an institute for values-driven leadership at the Benedictine University, and they've done some studies around this, and I can provide the links for that later.
Awesome.
There's also a number of organisations in the UK that are providing services about values-driven recruitment. So it's definitely it's a trend. We do need to understand through the recruitment process what the person stands for, but we at the same time need to be clear about what we stand for.
Absolutely.
And it's a matching of the values fit, but perspectives. We value diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
And so we value people that are different to us.
Yeah.
But they're in tune, and so that's why I think it's you've got your organizational values, you've got your community values, and your personal values, and that bit in the middle is your heartbeat.
Yeah.
That's your sweet spot, and that's what you're trying to do. That in your recruitment process, you're getting an understanding of what that person stands for.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we just need to define what fit means, and I think that is open for defining, and that's why I like forums like this, is to keep conversing. And I'll be interested for people to type into the chat, what do they think when it means values fit? How do they go about determining values fit with a new recruit? Or you're a consulting firm and you're bringing on a new partner. How do you determine that? Or, a whole range of different things. The same goes with your suppliers. And this whole thing for me is around the life cycle of values includes everything. It's not just about values fit, but does your suppliers and the people that are using your product, are they a values fit?
I couldn't agree more. And values, whether we know it, whether we're conscious of it or not, comes into the way in which we make our decisions, into who we hire, who we work with, down to your logo person, down to your web developer, even to the shop that you go to, whether you go to that shop or not. It all comes down to values. And excuse me for one moment. And without us even knowing, we make those decisions, but we don't know it enough to unpack it and to understand it. And I think bringing it to surface is so key. So yes, even with business partners, it doesn't really matter. Anyone that we work with VAs, it all comes back to values, doesn't it? So it's quite a powerful, topic for us to become aware of and to have conscious awareness around as well.
I think we've all been witness with the brand ethics that happened with particular Facebook and the use of particular advertisers, etc., and people pulling their ads off Facebook was a real strong values fit conversation. And I think that's part of the current reason of the surge and the interest in values, that was part of it, that particular episode in time. A very important statement around the importance of values.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you. I've just got a couple of comments here, Stephen, if I may share with you. Jeffrey says it's amazing how little the values conversation ever comes up in my years as a sales rep. Yeah, and it so shouldn't it? And it's really about starting that trend, because essentially it's such an important foundational piece of the puzzle that needs to be utilized. So thank you for that, Jeffrey. Gordon says, I've worked for 2 global MNCs last 10 years and never once had a values conversation. Wow. That's, and Gordon, thanks for sharing that. And I have to agree with you. I've worked for many organizations, or for 2 major organizations in my life, long-term employment, for federal and also corporate, and same. It just doesn't, they pin it up on the wall, but it's just not actually demonstrated. It's not, believed. So it's true. Alrighty. Now, do you use a specific model? So coming back to, you mentioned earlier, Stephen, that you don't use the word values per se, because sometimes people, and again, because we're so conditioned to the do, values, sometimes people think it's very fluffy. But it's not, it's solid. And so I'm curious, do you use a specific model that elicits the level of importance for a value?
Do I use a specific
Model?
model that elicits
Yeah.
this, what was the last bit?
The level of importance for the value, or for values specifically.
No, not per se. I think that it's quite natural for organisations around them easily to identify what's important to them, but it's just helping them refine those conversations through stories. If it's a startup, it's a different conversation. If it's a well-established organisation, they don't have a values statement, then it's looking, because the values will be already in existence within their organization.
Yeah.
And it's listening for the stories that will tell you what their values are. You just go around and listen to stories. And that's why the central to my framework around working with values is stories.
Awesome. Yeah, stories. I love that. And listening to the conversations and the dynamics, even observing the dynamics of teams, I think that tells a story in itself, because we tend to become blinded to what the values are, and we almost become, we suffocate with the do, sort of become suffocated. We can't see anything more because we're so into the meeting the KPIs and all the rest of it. We forget about them, and sometimes we really don't know them, so I was just curious as to whether you did have that. But I love what you said, in that you listen to conversations and stories. That's terrific. Do you I'm curious, Stephen, I wondered with you and your experience, given that values is what you stand for, do you have specific values for your personal life and then for your business?
No, I have one set of values, and I guess I also have principles, which are just a little bit different, guiding principles.
Mm-hmm.
And my values are just I use them in all parts of my life. For me, there's no such thing as work-life balance so much. It's like integrated life, and so I can see my values expressed in all parts of my life, whether it's with my family or whether it's my work. Whether there's one value that's more stronger when I'm,
Yeah.
in the professional domain, I'll have to be more aware of that. But what I do say is that I've been asking myself about my values since about the mid-90s,
Mm-hmm.
and they have changed.
Yes.
So
yes.
that's the important thing, is just being open for them to change.
Yes.
And I do feel that it's not a conversation that you can have on your own, that if you're just sitting down in your room and talking about what your values are, it becomes richer when you have had the conversation with others. So part of this Living Values Education program, where I was the national coordinator for, I went to Oxford for the training. And so there was 60 educators from all over the globe And so there were 60 of us in the room having conversations around values. Well, that was just an eye-opener for me.
That would have been
listening
incredible.
listening to what somebody else values. You know, there was one teacher who arrived almost a day and a half late. She was from a village in Africa, and people had donated to get her there, to get her to this conference. But she was a day and a half late because she missed a flight, etc. But she still walked into the room, and she wasn't worried about being a day and a half late because she was so happy that she was there.
Yeah.
And her infectiousness just lifted the whole room, and we said, oh, I don't have a problem in the world after listening to her story. And I think that that's what happens, that
Yes.
when you start having the conversation, because Australia is so multicultural, and I know we've got people from other countries on the call, and even, say, for example, in India, you've got so many different states, so many different languages, so many different cultures. It's really important that you give people an opportunity to have the conversations around personal values.
Yes.
And it's part of the equation: personal values, community values, organizational values. Conversation has to be had around all three.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing the story and for raising that too, Stephen. That's awesome. I've got a couple of questions for you, if I may, from the audience. Jeffrey asks, have you noticed how much more difficult the pandemic has been for organizations who don't live those values? What a terrific question. That's very powerful. Yeah, totally agree.
I think the flip side of that, and it's a great question, thank you. Yeah. Was that Gordon that asked that?
Jeffrey. Yeah.
Jeffrey. Yeah, it's a great question, Jeffrey. I think the flip side of that is those that have strong values have flourished.
Yes.
You know, there's lots of stories that are coming out now of organizations that were strongly values-based before the pandemic, and they use that as their pivot. And really asking themselves, what do they do next, and guiding them in every step of the way. Is this true to our values? Because they're used to asking themselves the questions.
Right.
They're used to values dilemmas. And that's an important thing for us to understand with values work, is that there will be dilemmas.
Yes.
The dilemmas will be there, and we just need to get used to having questions, to having conversations and dialogue around those dilemmas. We will be able to sort it out. We just have to talk about it.
Absolutely. And it's building that muscle around having the language around it. It's like anything new, isn't it?
Great question.
Stephen,
thanks, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. I have another. Ellie, thank you. Ellie asks, would appreciate some examples of very simplistic questions that tease our discussions, that helps individuals understand a common value or bridge the gap of not knowing each other. Thanks for asking that, Ellie.
Yeah, you can, it can be a simple one, as I said before. Who's the leader? It can be in your real life. Of somebody you really admired, and what was it that you valued about that person? Or it could be as simple, it can be your manager, it can be somebody that's in your community, is one. Another one that we've used is around literature. So what is your favorite literature or piece of literature or poem, and what was it that you liked about that? What was it that you valued about that particular story or that particular poem? And then it's just a matter of what it brings up in conversation. And my favorite one, particularly in India, is songs, because everybody in India has some song. Everybody is connected to their traditional songs. And so asking them about a song and what is it that you value about, and then somebody will end up taking the microphone and singing a song. So I think that the thing behind asking the questions around values is mixing it up and having fun. I have a set of values cards, and when we're face to face, I use those values cards as a basis of conversation and discussion.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Thanks,
it was Ellie. Great question, Ellie. That was awesome. And thanks for answering that.
Appreciate it.
Your cards sound incredible. And also too, I think, to become more observant of people's environment, because our environment communicates to us, our environment communicates to others. So being really observant of what people have around them. It could be photos of family, dogs, whatever, and that gives us an indication of what they value and what's important to them. That's also a great way of building and connecting with people too. So yeah, being observant of all those too. So that's wonderful. Thanks so much, Stephen. So having worked, Stephen, at such, at a leadership level across different countries, I'm really curious, what have you learned about values culturally? How have you seen a difference?
I think what I've noticed, because not only with organisations but running values workshops as well, is that a very common set of values keep coming up again and again and again. Right. Whether I'm in Philippines or whether I'm in Malaysia, whether I'm in Thailand, whether I'm in India, values is a language which is common across cultures. Right. There may be some fine tuning, some subtle differences about what's really important to people in that culture, but largely the set of values that they discuss is very similar. But right. you'll have differences, like Jeffrey explained, around the value around humility. So it may have more strong cultural preference in the East, and than it may do in the West. So there'll be ones that are expressed more strongly. Right. Those that are aspired to and those that are lived are often a little bit different.
Right. So you've noticed that difference sort of in different countries, where certain countries sort of values is what they live from, and then others don't sort of like, they don't make it their foundation. They don't make it their
I think there's a gap for all of us between our higher order values and our degree to which we live them. I remember having this conversation, immediately after we had this conversation across this hospital around values. And I remember the very next day, and we're talking about them, and somebody came up to me and said, "Look, I told you this values project wasn't going to work. We talked about this value of honesty yesterday, and look at this person," and gives me this story about this person and dishonesty, etc. Right. And it's a journey. Yes. And it's about holding the space for each other, because we slip up, and we don't live our values as much as we would want to all of the time, and that's just the way it is. We're human beings. Absolutely. And so I think a values-based culture respects that, and we don't try to crucify somebody once there's been a slip up, the bad apple syndrome.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And as you said, we are human and we are going to slip up no matter what the circumstance. And it is just a learning curve, isn't it? And I love what you said earlier, that it is a journey, because it's something that we're not familiar with. It's not something that's on the forefront. It's something that we're starting to now bring to the forefront, and having these conversations and language around it will definitely, make it'll build our muscle around that.
I'm liking the chat from Yadja there about the importance of having conversations on a regular basis. Yes. And I think that the real opportunity is that once you start talking about your organizational values, is then how do you implement that into all of your processes? So we've talked about recruitment and fit for values. But then, as was mentioned, with respect to the sales process, with respect to the marketing process, with respect to the procurement process. Yes. And once you get those people together and so, well, what do our values look like in this situation? What do they look like now? How would we like them to look like? Yeah. And it's just about a conversation, and you'll be surprised what comes up.
Absolutely. But it's also in your personal space too, Stephen. It's not just your workspace. We've got to remember that we also have values, and how we build our relationships even in our personal space at home, with our kids, with our partners, with our friends, with our relatives, you know, family in general. So even with ourselves, more importantly, is where they should start from, really. So values is a holistic thing. It's a thing that embraces every aspect of our life. Yeah.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. Alrighty. So what's your take on, I just wanted to throw this one in as an additional, because I know that you love a bit of a challenge there, Steve.
Thank you.
What's your take on goals versus values?
Right, good question.
Mm-hmm.
Look, our goals may shift more readily, and there may be short-term goals and long-term goals, and values is really the fuel or the seed for which we achieve those particular goals. Or they're the source of inspiration, they're the guiding force behind why those goals exist. And often you'll find that if there's not an alignment between your goals and your values, then there's less chance of those goals becoming a reality.
Beautifully said. Wonderful. And having worked with so many individuals and organizations and teams, have you, in terms of your research then, because I'm guessing you would have researched a lot of, you know, what's worked, what hasn't, it's in the alignment where goals are achieved, I guess, rather than when everyone has no idea of where they're headed and what their values are, where things sort of tend to fall apart and results aren't achieved.
Yeah, look, again, and I know I'm sounding like I'm harping, it's around constant conversations around the values in different situations and different scenarios. I did some work with a hospital in Thailand, and this is really what started me to think about this whole conversation of alignment between personal, organisational and community values.
Right.
And this was a drug rehabilitation hospital, and they were renowned actually across the world for their work in drug rehabilitation.
Okay.
And so what they were learning to do was to have these conversations in all aspects, whether it's clinical care, the dilemmas that you have around treatment options when somebody's not able to make a decision, how values can inform those conversations. So the point is that you're constantly learning how to have a conversation around values in every particular situation. And as you develop the muscle for having that conversation at all levels of the organization, that's when you start to become a mature values-based culture.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. That's fantastic. So I'm just going to ask whether anyone has any questions at all for Stephen. If you'd like something clarified whilst we have Stephen here. So whilst we're waiting to see if anyone puts anything in the chat there, Stephen, I'm curious if there's one piece of advice, I guess, and I know that you've given lots today, but one that really stands out for you more right now around, you know, advice that you could potentially give leaders, what would that be?
Experiment is the first thing. And I come from a quality background. And we had this terminology called plan, do, check, act.
Nice.
And, you know, plan what you're going to do what you said you're going to do, check that you've done what you said you were going to do, and act to hold the game. And the same goes with respect to values, is experiment. Experiment with your management meetings or your team meetings of introducing conversations around your values. And they can be short conversations, so don't overdo it to start with, and say, look, you know, we've got these 5 values, let's talk about this in terms of our procurement process or about our sales process. So introduce opportunities for people to talk about it, and there'll be plenty of debate, and then it will continue. If it's continued over into the tea room and into the lunchroom, and then somebody comes back and asks you a next question, your experiment is working.
Yeah.
And then also the language that you use. If you're seeing a value being lived within the organization, how you acknowledge that and
Nice.
elevate it.
I love that. Yeah.
And that's the whole thing is that the capacity to listen for stories that demonstrate that your value is being lived.
Yeah.
And so using your communication channels, you know, there's one organization in India, they created a book. And first of all, they got a professional writer who helped them rewrite those stories, and then they just published them on an email list. And they went out, and then it just became the most subscribed email list in the organization. And
Wow.
everybody would, because it would be published on every second Tuesday, and people were waiting for that story
Yeah.
to come out, because it became really interesting, and people were interested in what those values were and the stories around them.
What a wonderful idea. I love that. And, you know, I love what you shared. And thank you so much for sharing that advice too on here. I think it's important. And to our listeners and to people who are going to tap in even later when they watch this video moving forward. But, you know, it's also knowing that when you're having those conversations, as you said, Stephen, and you made some incredibly important points, it's not just using the word values, you know, it's even, as you said, acknowledging people for how they are or what they're doing. And even at your meetings, when you can have a look at what's not working and they may be needing to readjust or shift some things, it's a great way to have it as a benchmark even. So your benchmark of excellence, you know, and utilize it as benchmarks, and whether you're actually reaching what it is or whether you're on trajectory and you're on track. And it is a great way, I think, to better manage that and better monitor that as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, yep. Look, I think that values-based leader put culture first on their to-do list.
Yeah.
And so that means that, you know, it's so easy to put culture at the bottom of your list, but if you put it at the top of the list, it's easy. You're just going around and you listen for stories.
Yes.
And you have conversations with people about how things are working. And I think that that's half of the work of a leader today, is culture is at the top of their to-do list. And again, we have to experiment with that. What does working with culture look like for us? And working out how to do that on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, you said a very important word right there, the word listen. And I think as leaders, and from my observation over the years, and I'm guessing yours too, Stephen, is that leaders and people are in such a rush to do things, they don't stop to listen, to understand, and to really hear. We're just sort of listening to answer, you know, and to do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and which is why culture sort of tends to break down. So listening is key, understanding people.
And I think that what I've noticed over the last 6 months is, now that you've got such a huge proportion of organisations working in distributed teams, remotely, working from home, the whole question of culture becomes even more important.
Yeah.
And so it's a total new dynamic now, whereas you don't have the office conversations, you don't have the water cooler moments,
Yes.
And you have to think differently how to have these conversations in the online space, how to have those moments where the culture building moments, or how to listen more about what's being said and what's not being said about people's experience from working from home.
Absolutely.
And simply providing opportunities to debrief. How's the working from home been going for you? Because the first 6 weeks is definitely different from the last 6 weeks.
Totally.
It's going to be very different from people in Melbourne who were locked down and then free and then locked down, you know. And people in India, my good friend is in Mumbai, and they've been locked down since March the 18th.
Wow.
In an office, in a office complex, and in a building complex, unit complex.
Yeah.
So really having ongoing conversations, because things are changing for people, and it's very different what we have to do on the online space, creating that psychological safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're
Is an
right in what you
important
said.
skill.
Yeah, the gap is key to be able to hear what's not being said. I've just got a couple of questions for you, if I may.
Right.
Yaja asks, people would find having conversations one to one kind of awkward at first. What are ways we can initiate such conversations? I think you might have answered that one, but perhaps you'd like to add a little bit more, maybe to that.
Well, I think you know, in the face-to-face situation in the office, there's those moments around the water cooler and the coffee, and they're natural. They have to be natural, not planned, etc. And I think that's the key part of it. I think um, people want to see that their leaders are playful and not serious all of the time, and so I think that's a part of it. In the online space, it's different. You know, just general inquiries about people and their well-being is often enough, but building that up over time when people see that you're genuine and that you're expressing interest in their life. It's sort of there's a very good book that's very useful on this by Edgar Sheen called Humble Inquiry, and also a book called The Humble Consultant, both written by Edgar Sheen. It's a superb book that helps you the various levels of building trust with a person whilst maintaining boundaries.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for answering that question, and thank you for sharing the author. So it was Ed Karshin.
Edgar Sheen, Schein.
Perhaps you'd like to pop that in the chat.
I'll do that once I've finished
that'll be
speaking.
good.
I'll put that in.
Awesome.
What other questions we got there?
Yep, I'll come back. Yep, to you in one. Let me have a quick look. The other one is from Stephen. Can people have different values yet agree on appropriate behaviours? Great question, Stephen, and great question, Yaja, before. Thank you for engaging.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's about the space that we provide for those conversations to happen. And I think that's one of the leaders, that's one of the values, one of the skills of a values-based leader is their ability to hold the space. And what that means for you is different, and that's probably a whole new webinar around holding the space. But, you know, enabling as a leader being neutral, creating, I guess, sometimes ground rules around the types, how we have conversations together. But it's really creating a safe space for people just to dialogue and talk about the issue in a respectful way. But if you don't talk about it, it's difficult for there to be alignment, but there has to be conversation and dialogue. But Thank you, Stephen. Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for answering that, Stephen. Beautiful. I trust that's answered your question there.
I'm sure if it hasn't, Stephen will contact me offline and tune my ear.
Awesome. So, Stephen, noticing the time, and I'm mindful of the time as well, this has been an extraordinary conversation. I love chatting with you. What resources have you made available for our audience, I guess, to tap into in terms of values, or anything that you may have available for them that could potentially assist them?
Sure. I've got one blog and another blog that has just gone up today, and it's largely around what I've talked about today. So there'll be some reinforcements and some little practical tips. I'm very happy for people and would love it. I would be delighted if people reach out to me on LinkedIn to continue the conversation. In the next couple of weeks, I'm going to run a free 90-minute conversation around how to have these conversations in your organisation. So that will be, I'll give that to Yaji soon. And that will be 90-minute conversation just to see how simple these types of conversations can be. And we'll experiment it with ourselves, between ourselves, and then be lots of opportunities to ask more questions like you have today.
Awesome. Thank you. That's so very generous of you too. A 90-minute free session. That's terrific. Filled with your expertise, insights, and experiences. That's great.
The more values-based cultures and values-based leaders there are in the world will be a better place. And as Jeffrey said, you know, providing opportunities for people to think differently about leadership. I think that's all of our responsibility.
Absolutely. Well said, Stephen. Thank you so very much. And I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for your time today. And thank you for adding so much value to our audience. And I've really enjoyed having a conversation with you. So, and I look forward to connecting with you even more outside of this forum too. So thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you to our audience for asking some incredible questions and for engaging. And again, all of Stephen's details, all of the contact details and all of what, and I guess your session too coming up in a couple of weeks will be included in the upcoming email to you as well. Terrific. Thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate it.